We've all felt that low, almost ridiculous hum of anxiety when we check into a hotel room or a rental apartment.
Oh, yeah.
That feeling that maybe hidden in the alarm clock or, behind the smoke detector, something is watching.
You do the scan, the quick scan around the room.
Exactly. It's usually an irrational fear, right? A byproduct of too many true crime documentaries. But tonight's deep dive is about what happens when that paranoia stops being irrational and becomes the brutal, life-shattering reality for hundreds of people.
And that is the essential terror of this case.
Mm.
This story, which we've dubbed the Sister Hong Files, it moved with terrifying speed. It leaped from these quiet online forums and private chats to massive national headlines.
It was everywhere.
It wasn't just a criminal case. It tore open a Pandora's box of deep systemic anxieties in Chinese society, touching on deception, the economics of desire, the limits of privacy rights, and, well, the profound, often unacknowledged burden of public shame.
So today, we are dissecting the architecture of one of the most sophisticated and, frankly, disturbing digital deception schemes we've seen reported in recent memory. The core anxiety here, for you, the listener, is just the sheer terror of having the most intimate moment of your life exposed globally. And then the compounding realization that that moment of perceived trust and connection was, from start to finish, a meticulous, sophisticated, premeditated lie designed for digital monetization.
So the setting for this whole digital drama is the city of Nanjing in China.
Yeah.
Rapidly evolving, hyper-connected metropolis.
A huge city. And the timeline we're talking about is recent. It's visceral. It all culminates in the detention of the primary suspect in the summer of 2025.
Yeah, and the story didn't trickle out, did it? It was more like an explosion.
It was an absolute explosion. In the Jiangning district of Nanjing, police detained a 38-year-old man, surnamed Jiao. He was immediately accused of orchestrating this massive, massive privacy violation.
And when the initial reports hit the internet, they were chaotic, visceral, and frankly, stomach-churning in what they were implying.
Right.
What really defined that initial shockwave was the sheer volume of reported victims. The sources we have speak of hundreds of men.
Hundreds.
Yeah. Students trying to navigate life in the city, rising professionals, married fathers who came forward, all had engaged in what they believed were private, consensual encounters with a woman, only to learn that their moments had been captured and distributed without their knowledge or consent.
And the alias Jiao was operating under became instantly infamous, just synonymous with digital betrayal. Sister Hong or Hong Ji.
Right, and netizens, with their characteristic speed, they quickly assigned additional nicknames like Red Uncle or Red Sister.
Of course they did.
That name, Sister Hong, it started signifying this massive systemic breach of trust and identity fraud.
The essence of the crime here isn't simple theft. It's like the transformation of human connection into a data point.
Yes. Jiao is accused of turning intimacy into forensic evidence and trust into a highly sought-after commodity. This was done using meticulously placed hidden cameras in the rented spaces where these encounters took place.
So this wasn't just a matter of infidelity or some simple fraud. It was a large-scale, methodical, almost industrial digital harvest of vulnerability.
An industrial harvest. That's a good way to put it.
And here's where the initial scale became truly terrifying and where the social frenzy really began. Early, frantic, and unconfirmed reports claimed there were over 1,600 victims.
Wow.
When you hear a number like that, it stops being a local crime and it starts feeling like a systemic failure, an entire ecosystem of potentially ruined personal and professional lives.
And those initial rumors, they didn't just stop at the videos themselves. The most damaging part was the alleged circulation of contact lists.
Oh, that's the nightmare scenario.
It is. We're talking about screenshots that supposedly contained victims' headshots, their WeChat IDs, and their phone numbers. This immediately escalated the violation from a matter of private shame into the absolute panic of potential doxing, public identification, and immediate professional or familial crisis.
Unbelievable.
So the sheer scope of that early rumor, it immediately caused this societal frenzy, forcing the authorities to respond at maximum speed.
And that initial chaotic scale really set the stage. The sheer human cost meant this was never going to be an easy investigation, nor a simple healing process for those involved. It was a digital crime that just ripped the veneer off modern relationships.
To really understand the trauma, I think we have to first look at the complexity of the deception itself. This was not a crude attempt at impersonation.
No.
The sources all emphasize this was a committed illusion, something maintained over a very long period.
That depth of commitment is absolutely crucial to understanding this. We're not just talking about throwing on a dress and a wig. This involved heavy, skillful makeup applied specifically to obscure the 5 o'clock shadow and to, soften the naturally masculinizing contours of the bone structure. It was professional.
And we have to remember that the purpose of the disguise wasn't perfection, but plausibility. Just enough to disarm suspicion in a dimly lit, intimate setting.
He wasn't trying to pass in broad daylight on a busy street.
Exactly. It required a convincing wig, carefully chosen feminine clothing, to cleverly conceal the male physique, and this is critical, an altered feminine voice and a practiced cadence. Jiao effectively constructed and diligently performed an entirely new persona.
That level of commitment shows a really deep understanding of human psychology, specifically the psychology of expectation and desire. The goal wasn't just to look the part, but to sound and act the part convincingly enough that any initial suspicion, if it even existed, was immediately dismissed.
It really speaks to a profound dedication to maintaining this predatory structure, all for the purpose of harvesting data.
But the truly fascinating and just horribly twisted element of the whole operation was the non-transactional bait he used for seduction.
Yes, this element was genius because it successfully masked the underlying predatory commercial nature of the encounter.
That's where the systemic fraud gets layered right on top of the identity fraud. There was no direct cash payment up front for the encounter, which would instantly remove the stigma of sex work, which might trigger, legal or moral caution in some of the victims.
Instead, the price of admission was astonishingly low and profoundly mundane.
Not a payment, it was framed as a token of goodwill.
A token of goodwill, exactly. A bag of fruit, a carton of milk, or a simple bottle of cooking oil. This seemingly innocent exchange was the key mechanism for disarming the victim.
So effectively, a grocery run.
Pretty much.
That's all it took to purchase what the victim believed was private intimacy.
And that's exactly why it worked so well. It made the exchange feel almost polite, as one source observed. By framing the exchange around these minor domestic tokens, it stripped away the immediate label of a highly transactional encounter.
So it disguised the deep commercial intent completely.
Completely. It turned the interaction into what can only be described as a twisted parody of a date or, a nascent secret relationship sealed by a minor token of affection. The victims felt they were engaging in something human, intimate, and discreet, not something being harvested for digital profit.
So if the illusion of identity and the illusion of transaction were the stagecraft, the architectural design of the crime was the hidden lens itself. This wasn't some haphazard phone placement. This was professional, meticulous surveillance.
Yeah, the sourcing highlights the almost routine nature of the hiding spots, which really speaks to Jiao's experience. These were professional-grade mechanisms, often concealed in plain sight.
Like where?
Cameras were hidden in the ceiling to capture wide, elevated angles. They were integrated into the components of an alarm clock, or strategically placed on the lip of a shelf, camouflaged amongst other items.
So they chose locations where the victim, who is already psychologically disarmed by the performance and the whole non-transactional nature of the exchange, would never, ever think to look.
Not in a million years. The moment the victim walked through that door and the performance began, the recording had already started.
And this is where the operation moved from preparation to production. The process didn't end when the encounter did.
No, not at all. The footage was never intended for private voyeuristic viewing by the perpetrator alone. It was immediately moved on to what we really have to call a digital production line of humiliation.
A production line designed for maximum marketability.
Precisely. The files weren't just dumped onto a hard drive. They were processed systematically. Renamed with identifying tags, clips were trimmed for optimal length, and flow for distribution. And faces and body language were likely studied to refine the performance for future encounters. This wasn't a hobby. It was an industrial operation designed to capture, edit, and then monetize highly sensitive personal data on a massive scale.
The calculated, methodical nature is what elevates this from simple deception to systemic, calculated exploitation. So once that footage was processed on the production line, the distribution network activated. This created the digital tsunami that ultimately became the global headline. And this distribution, it wasn't centralized, it was diffuse, intentionally hidden, and engineered to evade quick takedowns.
If the first point of exploitation was the physical encounter, the second was the digital dissemination. So where did these compromised files allegedly end up?
Right.
We know they were scattered across obscure, often region-specific online forums, specialized private groups on platforms like Weibo that cater to illicit content, encrypted channels on messaging apps like Telegram, and crucially, overseas forums where the reach of Chinese law is, very difficult to enforce.
And this dissemination was immediately financialized. The victims paid in milk and fruit for the experience, but the anonymous consumers paid real money for the content.
That's the core irony you mentioned earlier. This material was packaged and sold as a product. Reports detailed a specific financial model where the administrators of these dark web libraries and encrypted groups demanded membership fees.
How much are we talking?
Specifically, around 150 yuan, which is roughly 20 to 25 USD, for access to this library of shame.
So not a huge amount, but when you scale it up.
Exactly. This confirms the profound commercial intent that underpinned the entire operation, turning cheap emotional vulnerability into substantial, steady revenue.
Let's circle back to that staggering, exaggerated number from the beginning, the 1,600-plus victim count. That number was an immediate psychological weapon. It fueled the initial firestorm of panic, but the authorities, they had to act swiftly to temper that frenzy.
They had no choice but to intervene in the public discourse. A number that high suggests a total breakdown of security and morality. So authorities explicitly called the number an online exaggeration, a form of deliberate information manipulation, really attempting to control the narrative.
The intent was to prevent mass hysteria, right? Contain the social fallout and frame the incident as a serious but finite criminal case that the justice system could handle.
But the consequence of controlling that narrative, especially by not replacing the 1,600 with a precise official number, was the creation of a terrifying vacuum. And that void is the precise location where paralyzing fear sets in. The absence of a concrete number allows the public imagination, and crucially the imagination of potentially compromised men, to fill the gap with the worst-case scenario.
So it leaves unknown men just paralyzed by shame, sitting in silence, wondering if their face is included in the actual police tally.
And they're too afraid to come forward because their contact with the police would be the very act that confirms their involvement to their family or partner.
It's a catch-22. We do have some fragment descriptions of who these victims were, and it paint a partial but important picture. A foreign exchange student, a gym enthusiast focused on fitness, a white-collar worker from a respected firm.
Right, and reports of some men being repeat visitors.
The fear facing these men was complex, total, and systemic. It was not just the trauma of the physical violation, but the absolute panic of potential recognition. Imagine being recognized by a family member, a partner, or a colleague in a video titled Sister Han Collection.
In a society where reputation and public image are paramount, this level of exposure could lead to absolute personal and professional ruin.
Divorce, job loss, social ostracization.
Everything. That pervasive, multifaceted fear is the overwhelming engine driving the silence we observe.
And this fear of exposure, it leads us to the darkest and frankly the most uncomfortable question raised by this whole file. Reports suggested some men may have suspected the deception. They may have noticed flaws in the disguise, heard the voice modulation, or sensed the performance, yet allegedly proceeded with the encounter anyway.
This specific detail raises a profoundly difficult set of societal issues. It forces us to examine the psychological landscape of life in modern Chinese megacities. Why would someone override their basic survival instinct and proceed under suspicion?
It seems like an impossible cognitive dissonance.
It highlights a potent and volatile mix of factors. First, the profound crippling loneliness that can exist even in the isolation of a hyper-connected, densely populated city. Second, the societal stigma around certain aspects of male sexuality, particularly non-traditional or same-sex encounters, which might push men toward highly discreet, anonymous, and even suspect situations as their only perceived safe outlet.
So the deep, desperate need for connection, or at least a temporary sexual or emotional outlet, it literally overrode basic skepticism, caution, and the survival instinct.
It perfectly illustrates how deeply vulnerability can be weaponized in a setting defined by isolation and social pressure. They were trading a carton of milk and a moment of manufactured intimacy for absolute, potentially lifelong digital exposure. Hashtag take 5E. The investigation and the controlled narrative. Following the official arrest of Jiao on July 6, 2025, the narrative shifts. It goes from public panic to just forensic labor. The initial frenzy was replaced by a methodical, complex police response.
The challenges here were fundamentally 21st century. This wasn't a case of lifting fingerprints or tracing some paper trail. The core task was massive, high-stakes data recovery,
Yeah.
seizing every hard drive, every mobile device, and attempting to map every strand of the digital distribution network. Every single video file had to be treated not just as contraband, but as a digital crime scene requiring careful forensic preservation and analysis.
And that data recovery, it led directly to the grim identification task.
Right.
How does law enforcement identify hundreds of potential victims in a way that minimizes secondary trauma?
A very delicate operation.
It had to be. The police had to meticulously utilize contact lists, chat logs, and financial records found on Jiao's seized devices to build a list of people they needed to contact.
And you have to think about the emotional and psychological violence inherent in that official police summons. For these men, the trauma was initially private, a secret shame they tried desperately to bury and forget.
And then the phone rings.
Exactly. Receiving an official police call or letter transforms that private horror into a terrifying, undeniable public reality that they now have to confront through official, bureaucratic, and highly exposed channels. The trauma in that police contact must be immense, forcing them to relive and officially document their worst experience.
And when the police released their official statements, they were extremely careful about how they framed the legal charges.
Right, the wording was key.
Very key. They confirmed Jiao's arrest for two primary charges under the law: making and selling pornographic materials and illegal use of surveillance equipment. This placed the incident firmly within the criminal legal framework, explicitly removing it from the domain of social media gossip or sensationalist rumor.
And this was where their deliberate strategy of containment became most evident. Debunking the wildly inflated 1600 number wasn't just about accuracy, it was essential to draining the sensational fuel from the case.
You have to calm things down.
You do. The police needed to frame this as a severe but ultimately finite and controllable criminal matter, an incident manageable by the state rather than a symptom of societal collapse.
Yet, the toxic digital environment the scandal had spawned, it continued to grow, entirely independent of the police investigation. This led to serious warnings from authorities about secondary predation.
It's a truly insidious layer of exploitation. We saw bad actors, criminal opportunists, immediately posing as official figures, sometimes as police officers, sometimes as supposed hackers, and exploiting the victim's absolute paralyzing fear of exposure by demanding money,
Promising the impossible,
promising to delete the footage or remove their data from the dark web.
which is exploitation layered upon the original exploitation. The victims, already terrified and desperate to make the problem vanish, were being shaken down because the original crime had installed a profound exploitable terror in them.
And these secondary scammers leveraged that specific psychological fear. The victims didn't fear financial loss as much as they feared their lives being destroyed by recognition.
So the scammers provided a false hope for erasure, demanding payment to cure a digital wound that, as we know, can never truly be healed.
The Sister Hong scandal quickly transcended the police file. It started to function as a sort of a national social Rorschach test, reflecting and amplifying some of the most deep-seated anxieties within modern Chinese society about morality, surveillance, identity in the digital age.
All of it. And the initial public reaction was often harsh and immediate, rampant mockery. We saw the spread of red uncle memes, the jokes about the victims' supposed lack of discernment.
A general dismissiveness of their situation.
Yeah, and this mockery served as a perverse pressure release for the public, allowing people to distance themselves from the victims, but it inflicted further psychological damage on those already suffering.
And this widespread mockery, it connects directly to a deep undercurrent of anxiety surrounding masculinity and shame in the cultural context.
Absolutely. The conversation was less about the perpetrator's calculated fraud and more about the victim's failure to perceive the disguise.
So victim-blaming.
In a way, yes. This specific cultural framing implicitly suggests a failure of masculine acuity. By being duped, the victims were subtly framed as foolish, naive, or perhaps even challenging specific heteronormative expectations simply by entering into such a situation.
So the cultural focus became intensely focused on the victim's lack of discernment, which amplified the deep, unique, and often unacknowledged shame men experience in public scandals involving sex and deception.
We have to consider the cultural weight of mianzi, or face, here. Losing face in a public and humiliating manner like this is devastating to reputation and status, which are intrinsically linked to perceived masculinity and competence in many Chinese societal structures.
So the inability to spot a committed illusion becomes interpreted as a fundamental lack of wisdom or control.
Exactly. The consequence is that the victim is tacitly blamed for the violence enacted upon them. The mockery works to enforce traditional societal norms, reinforcing the idea that if a man were stronger, smarter, or more discerning, he would not have been caught in this trap. The shame becomes a heavier burden than the criminal act itself.
But moving beyond the specifics of masculinity, the truly universal fear exposed by this case was the seismic anxiety over privacy and personal security. The hidden camera has fully evolved into the iconic, chilling tool of the age, a symbol that vulnerability is total.
The Sister Hong case provided devastating proof that the threat is real, it's scaled, and it's highly professionalized. The core fear that your most private, most vulnerable moment in a semi-private space like a hotel or a rented apartment could be instantly converted into public monetized content without your knowledge that led to a collective, hypervigilant paranoia across the country.
It represented a complete and, let's be honest, justified withdrawal of trust from the security of seemingly private physical spaces.
And this national realization, it naturally triggered intense public debate regarding the adequacy of China's legal framework, particularly in light of strengthened privacy protections enacted just a few years earlier.
Right, there had been progress on that front.
There had. Legal experts immediately pointed to the relevance of China's Personal Information Protection Law, or PIPL, which was enacted in 2021.
A fairly recent law.
Very recent, and it's comprehensive and robust. The non-consensual collection and subsequent distribution of intimate footage qualifies as a blatant, severe violation of PIPL, specifically because this footage is considered sensitive personal information. PIPL is designed precisely to regulate the collection, handling, and storage of personal data, especially data related to sexual life or health.
So the laws exist, and they are strong, but the case exposed a critical, terrifying weakness: the difficulty in enforcing them in the face of rapid, borderless digital leakage.
Absolutely. While the PIPL provides strong legal tools for prosecuting Jiao domestically and imposing penalties on domestic platforms that cooperate in the distribution, the enforcement hits a wall the moment the data jumps jurisdiction.
It goes overseas.
It goes overseas. The internet is rapid, borderless, and utilizing platforms like Telegram or overseas forums allows the distribution network to remain functionally beyond the reach of the Nanjing police or the Chinese court system.
So, prosecuting Jiao is one thing, but chasing every single leak, every file shared across peer-to-peer networks, and every secondary seller who paid the 150 yuan membership fee becomes a legal and technological nightmare.
The speed of digital leakage outpaces the speed of legal enforcement by a factor of thousands. The damage is instantaneous and permanent.
And this permanence contributes directly to the final and most heartbreaking element of the societal fallout: the stigma of silence surrounding the victims. We know very few men came forward publicly.
And that silence is due to that unique, profoundly silencing stigma attached to the violation of the sexual self, especially when coupled with the shame of deception in conservative cultures. Their pain, their terror, their vulnerability, all were discussed and dissected everywhere, on social media, in news commentary, and police reports.
But the victims themselves remained almost entirely invisible and voiceless.
Suffering intensely in isolation, unable to speak out for fear of confirming their involvement and triggering the social ruin they dreaded.
Their suffering was widely discussed by everyone except them. That is the crucial detail that highlights the overwhelming societal burden of shame placed squarely upon the victims, not the perpetrator. #6. The legal and human endgame.
Looking ahead, the legal endgame for Jiao, the perpetrator, is clear in its severity, even though the case is currently pending trial and the final sentence has not been determined.
He's facing serious consequences.
Very serious consequences under the Chinese criminal code.
So if we look at the specific charges, producing and selling pornographic materials and illegal use of surveillance equipment, what is the typical range of penalty he could be facing?
Well, the penalty for producing and selling pornographic materials carries a baseline sentence of over 3 years in prison. However, the legislation includes provisions for severe circumstances.
And this has to qualify as severe.
Oh, absolutely. Given the sheer number of victims, even if the official tally is significantly lower than 1,600, the systematic commercial distribution model, and the use of sophisticated deception, this case almost certainly qualifies as severe.
Meaning, the court has the discretion to impose a much longer sentence.
Exactly. We could be talking about sentences significantly exceeding the minimum threshold, potentially reaching over 10 years. Plus, additional liability for the illegal installation and use of surveillance equipment,
Which is a separate criminal act.
a separate act,
Yeah.
and potentially even charges related to fraud due to the deception used to secure the encounters. The legal system will come down hard on the calculated commercial nature of the exploitation.
When we look at the initial public discourse, especially in Western reporting, there was some initial confusion about how to legally frame the motive, particularly given the element of cross-dressing.
Yes, there was an initial attempt by some commentators to frame the issue through an LGBTQ plus or identity politics lens.
I remember seeing that.
But the consistent messaging from Chinese legal experts and the broader domestic internet discourse firmly rejected that framing. They view the cross-dressing element not as a matter of identity for the court to consider, but strictly as the tool of the fraud, the privacy violation, and the illegal production of illicit materials.
So the legal focus remains strictly on the criminal exploitation of trust and privacy, regardless of Jiao's personal identity or motivations behind the disguise.
That is the essential legal distinction being drawn. The state is prosecuting the violation of law, not the underlying choice of disguise. However, we must also reflect on the inherent limitations of the legal system in addressing trauma of this magnitude.
Right.
Prison time punishes the perpetrator, which is necessary for justice, but it can never perform the true act of psychological healing that the victims desperately need.
It cannot scrub the videos from the internet, it cannot erase the memory of the violation, or undo the profound trauma of having your life captured and consumed by thousands of strangers globally.
The violation is permanent, because the digital record is permanent. The legal system offers closure for the crime, but no closure for the digital dissemination. And that brings us to the haunting final reality of this case: the digital ghosts.
The knowledge that these videos, regardless of Zhao's sentence, will circulate for years in the dark corners of the internet, completely outside the control of the Chinese legal system or the victims themselves.
And that is the lasting, ongoing human cost. These men, the victims, carry a secret, gnawing terror, a constant knowledge that they may one day be recognized. They might meet a new coworker, interview with a future employer, or start a new relationship with a partner who, through a random internet search, stumbles upon a video titled something innocuous like Sister Hong Collection.
The terror is ongoing, irrespective of Zhao's sentence, because the digital footprint of their most vulnerable moment is immutable.
The ultimate success of the criminal operation wasn't the revenue it generated. It was the fact that it installed permanent, debilitating fear into the lives of hundreds of people.
And that fear isn't limited to the identified victims. It's the collective fear that now permeates every aspect of semi-private life. #7 outro.
So I think the core lesson of the Sister Hong files is profound and it's multi-layered. It is perhaps the definitive 21st century study in digital vulnerability, exposing precisely how quickly and easily technology can be weaponized to harvest and monetize intimacy.
A case study for our times.
It really is. It confirms the profound impotence of old, analog notions of privacy when confronted with sophisticated, scalable digital exploitation that can jump borders instantaneously.
That's the perfect synthesis. The most dangerous disguise in this entire operation wasn't the wig, the skillful makeup, or the feminine voice. It was the illusion of privacy itself that was shattered for an entire nation.
Yeah.
The performance wasn't just staged for the individual victims. The entire set design of trust and discretion was created to fool society at large.
And the irony we must not lose sight of is the economic one. The high cost of digital content sold for 150 yuan a membership, built upon the cheap emotional vulnerability secured by a carton of milk and a bag of fruit. It asks us, what is the real market price of privacy when loneliness is the currency?
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, beyond the headlines? What is the lingering, provocative final thought we are left with as we step away from these files?
I think you have to consider the collective paranoia this incident instills. It creates the new, persistent, necessary habit of a second glance, a close, suspicious look at the smoke detector in a hotel room, a lingering inspection of the clock on the shelf in a rented apartment, or the need to unplug anything that seems remotely electronic.
It transforms us all, to some degree, into self-appointed security experts.
We all become amateur detectives in our own lives.
And when trust is permanently withdrawn, not just from anonymous online encounters, but from the digital world that surrounds every physical space we inhabit, what does that do to our ability to connect, to relax, and to feel secure in the world? That is the real, lasting legacy of the Sister Hong files.